Hi, my name is Liam Rice. I am the Assistant Director of Student Conduct at Emmanuel College, but also the Technology Knowledge Community Region 1 representative for NASPA. Region 1 is essentially all of New England, Western Europe, and Eastern Canada. I always flip-flop those two. And I'm very excited to host this great panel through NASPA today. We're going to switch it over to our moderator, Corinna, in a quick second, but just a brief overview. If there's any technical issues, if you can't hear somebody, feel free to message us in the chat. We'll be in there the whole time, but also if you have a question or want to say something, feel free to either send it in the chat or raise your hand, and you are more than welcome to come off mute if you want. There's no real structure around that you got to worry about. We will be recording the presentation today to put up on the NASPA Region 1 YouTube page after, just so you know. Your face may or may not be in it, depending on if you have your camera on or not, but just know that will be happening. Yeah, so we'll go through a couple of preset questions that we have, but like I said, at any point, feel free to ask questions that you want answered, because that's why you're here. And without further ado, I would love to turn it over to Corinna, and I'll give her a little brief introduction. So Corinna Kraemer is an academic advisor at Goodwin University and passionate about student success. She recently finished her master's in education at Springfield College and volunteers with NASPA as the Region 1 social media coordinator, so she knows a thing or two about social media. In her free time, Corinna enjoys painting and hanging out at the beach. In my personal experience, I know Corinna as a passionate advocate for digital communities and someone who exemplifies the best of today's new professionals. I added in that last part to her bio, not her. So without further ado, Corinna, why don't you take it away?
Thank you, Liam. So hello all, and I'm going to introduce our wonderful panelists today. So first up, Julia Golden uses they, them, theirs pronouns, is the Associate Dean of Student Affairs at Massachusetts College of Pharmacy and Health Sciences University in Boston, Massachusetts. Julia has been serving MCPHS University for 3.5 years and serves as a dean for the Boston, Worcester, and Manchester, New Hampshire campus. Julia overlooks diversity initiatives, training, and resources, as well as the Department of Residence Life. Currently, Julia is studying at University of Massachusetts, Boston for the Doctor of Philosophy in Higher Education. Julia's research includes secondary racial traumatic stress, examining how higher education may honor first responders of color who respond to racial discrimination and injustices. Julia feels it is important we examine how we care for professionals of color, as higher education was never meant to support people of color. An innovator in the NASPA Region 1 community, Julia asks, why bring a seat to the table when you can make your own table? Next up, Mr. Joshua Moore, who currently serves as the Director to the Office of Intercultural and Inclusion Student Services at Coastal Carolina University. Mr. Moore holds a Bachelor of Science degree in Human Resources Management and a Master of Arts in Education in Counseling and Student Affairs in Higher Education from Western Kentucky University. He is also a doctoral student at Texas A&M University Commerce. Mr. Moore has worked as a student affairs professional for over 10 years. With previous experiences from Western Kentucky University, Morehead State University, Texas A&M University Commerce, and Wittenberg University in areas such as residence life, multicultural affairs, student organizations and leadership, first year and transition programs, mentorship programs, student conduct, and bias incident reporting and response. Outside of higher ed, Joshua has served on many committees through various state, regional, and national organizations, such as the Coalition of Multicultural Affairs and the Pan-African Network with ACPA, and an advisory board member for the African American Student Leadership Experience with the Bryant Educational Leadership Group. He is very passionate about student affairs and higher education. His work is devoted to ensuring equity and inclusion for all students as they matriculate through the higher education system. Third up, Latoya Johnson, who uses she, her, hers, has a Master of Education from Temple University and is currently a student at William James College, where she is obtaining a doctorate in leadership psychology. Her education at William James College focuses on organizational development, psychology, and leadership. Latoya is a higher education practitioner whose career includes both student affairs and academic affairs and reflects experience in improving student success and engagement, strategic planning, organizational development, institutional diversity, talent recruitment, career development, and bringing change to learning specifically at small liberal arts residential campuses. She currently serves the Pine Manor College community in the capacity of Director of Co-Curricular Learning / Student Success Coach. Latoya is the founder and CEO of J. Ivy Consulting, a consulting firm committed to helping companies and individuals who want to root a legacy of justice and equity for all. Latoya is also a certified restorative practice facilitator and committed champion of social justice and the eradication of discrimination. And last but certainly not least, Liam Rice, he, him, his, is currently the Assistant Director for Student Conduct and Residence Director at Emmanuel College, Boston, where he coordinates Residence Hall student conduct, resident assistant training, on-call emergency interventions, and oversees the Residence Hall of first-year students. He is currently the founding editor for NASPA's Journal of Technology in Higher Education, Emerging Practice, a scholarly compendium exploring the impact and intersections of technology in higher education. He is also the Region 1 representative for the NASPA technology community and presents across the country on higher education, social media, and student development. His current research focuses on social media and new student affairs professional identity development. He firmly believes any educator can and should foster a vibrant digital campus community. So welcome to our 4 panelists. Awesome. Okay. Our first question for our 4 panelists is, before we discuss online conduct violations, let's start with how students, staff, and faculty gather digitally on your campus. What digital communities do you find at your institutions? And how do your offices foster community online? So let's start with Julia.
Absolutely. One of the things that we're seeing this semester more so than the past is that I think the election has brought up certain feelings of fear and, quite frankly, uncertainty. And I think that around the nation, we just have a very polarizing sentiment of people feeling like you're either on this side or that side, which I think is playing out in conduct actually quite often. And especially on my campus, bias incidents are actually on the rise. And on the nation, we know the FBI reports as bias incidents going up and up. So when it comes down to it is I think we're looking for a lot of different communities that are in a lens of healing, or at least just acknowledgement that, you know, it's okay if you're of a marginalized identity to feel like maybe right now you're not finding community. And if you can't, then this is a place where we can provide that online community effort. But it's something that isn't necessarily just through counseling. It's also through our student leaders saying that they want to provide a connection for one another peer-to-peer. So we're seeing that happen a lot for our students and faculty and staff supporting students within that. I think for staff and faculty, I'll be honest, I think right now we're so focused on getting through crisis management that it really isn't a sense right now that we can stop and have community. I will give one example that I think I'm really proud that MCPHS does. You know, we are a healthcare and pharmaceutical school that practices or tries our best to practice self-care when we can. And that's a privilege. And I think also we need to think about how do we decolonize the ideas of self-care. But one thing that MCPHS does is that we have something called caring for the caregivers, and that's acknowledging those who are on the front line or first responders for crisis management at MCPHS. And we do something where we simply just get together once a month and we just have fun and we just, you know, try to be a community and just see how each other's doing. And it sounds really simple, but I think that sometimes you need a simple moment just to collect your breath and just realize like, okay, I'm doing the best I can to serve this community. Let me just take a moment to reflect, but also just come together in a community. And I think that's one way we're really trying to engage, because if we don't take time to re-energize ourselves, this is nothing normal about this. It is happening right now. We're in a pandemic, so let's make sure that we take time out to reflect on how we're at least doing.
Thank you, Julia. How about from Joshua?
Yeah, I was gonna say piggybacking, but to follow up on what Julia shared, our institution is doing a lot of the same things. Our office, Intercultural Inclusion Services, actually has two initiatives that are thriving virtually right now. One for women of color and the other one for men of color, and they've been utilizing the virtual space as an opportunity to really focus on that self-care aspect of having to show up in spaces that may not have been meant for them, but really using it as an opportunity to check in with one another and using it as we need this to just be right now. But then also our Student Government Association is really doing a really good job of providing space visually for our students to engage, to talk about what's happening in the world and what does that mean for us here at CCU. Counseling Services and our office is actually hosting an event next week after the election, just to process all of what 2020 has offered us. It's offered us a lot. I think our students have had to push through a lot and haven't really had the opportunity to sit and feel and process what all of this means. And so everything from the pandemic, COVID pandemic, racism, police brutality, grief and loss of some very notable figures in our time, and really just giving them space to process that. And so we're hosting an event next week. The direction in which we go will be pending the election results. But either way, we're having it to just provide space for our students to gather, because we're not allowed to gather in person right now, as a lot of us aren't. And so being able to still show up and provide space for them to just be and process and feel and all of what that means for them.
I really liked Joshua and to an extent Julia's point too about this idea of like community space, right? And how there's so much research and literature on how people make communities online, especially traditionally college-age students, 18 from 24. And the core part of it, right, is it's not super different than what we normally do. If you think about your residence halls, right, or your student union, why do students hang out there and talk to each other? Because they want to interact with other people, right? They want to talk about how their classes are going. They want to, complain about the food that was in the dining hall that day. They want to talk about this professor that they have that, even though they're in different classes, they've had similar experiences. It's all about coming together and sharing and exchanging information and experiences, right? What do you do on social media? It's the same thing. When you are in a Zoom program hanging out with people on your floor as a student, you're trying to emulate the same things. It's this concept of networked publics, where even you go super far back in history, people just gathered together and wanted to talk and exchange experiences. And there are differences to being online in doing that, right? Transaction costs are a really big thing. It's a lot easier for me to say something online because it takes me about 5 seconds to write a tweet and send it out, and then there's no real short-term consequences to that, as opposed to if I said something in the middle of my residence hall lobby, right? There's a lower cost initially to doing it online, which, as I'm sure we'll talk about, is why the conversations you then have with students are about what are you thinking about when you're putting that sort of stuff out there. But that point about community space, right, is so important, because especially to all of my people in this panel that are, or attendees that are purely student conduct folk, like you're not overseeing a residence hall, you're not doing something else on campus, my heart goes out to you student conduct folk, because it's, in my opinion, student conduct isn't its own thing, right? It is fundamentally part of the community. And so when you're going to be doing this work about responding to community harm through student conduct, maybe through an adjudication hearing process, I think you get that it needs to be this community buy-in part of it, right? With these publics that you're coming together. And so that's going to require you really working with the other offices on campus to do the work before the violations take place.
And Latoya.
I think my colleagues have covered a great deal of it. But I will add that similar to what Liam just suggested, one of the things that's worked really well for us here, we are a micro community here at Pine Manor, is having drop-in hours centered around a specific topic. And that allows for the community that Liam is talking about, but also the kind of venting and frustrations that students would like to get out that both Joshua and Julia mentioned as well. So that has been kind of a low grade, very passive way for us to build community here.
Awesome. So from the early submitted questions, our next question is, what does a social media investigation in digital hearing look like? How do you set one up for success? And what are typical or appropriate sanctions for violations? And I'll direct that to Liam and then Julia.
I don't think there's a more loaded question than how to conduct an investigation in hearing when harm occurs online, especially through social media. I think as like a pure baseline thing, right? You need to go to your student handbook or your community standards that your students and staff and faculty agree to, and first see what language you have in there. Some schools, some institutions have specific social media policies where it's laid out the sort of conduct that's expected in there. And other schools don't, right? Your school might just lump it in under just general conduct. I know an institution who runs their social media conduct violations through their off-campus conduct policy because they view it as an off-campus thing. So I think it's figuring out where your institution's conduct standards currently line up with that. In terms of the actual hearing, again, there's a lot of ways, right, that you're simply just digitizing your in-person hearings that you may normally have, but being smart about it. I think a student conduct hearing on Zoom can be a very terrifying and very isolating thing, especially if you're a student who is just sitting alone at home on a computer with a hearing officer, or a student who doesn't have any consistent Wi-Fi access and is in their car in a parking lot because that's where they get their Wi-Fi, right? So when you're thinking about your conduct hearing stuff, I always, in my work, right, in the letter that you are writing up and sending the student, you need to have a plan B in there. That's like, hey, here's primarily how we do this. We do it on Teams at our school. If that does not work for you, here are the steps that we'll do. I'll do it over the phone with you, right? Because you ultimately, right, student conduct is not about punishing, it's about repairing harm and educating. The student needs to be getting to a place where they can do that, but starting off from a place that's like, hey, if you like need help learning how to even just get on Teams, because some people still struggle with that, right? Here's how to help out. And I guess one quick last thing, I Zoom especially, but enable a waiting room for your hearings. You just don't want people Zoom bombing your hearings. It happens all the time. And obviously putting a passcode on your meeting and then putting a waiting room really lets you control who can come in. But I'm also very clear in my letters and communications with students that it's a meeting between you and me, right? Because for some of our students here, I might have a parent or a guardian walk in and just suddenly join the meeting where they normally couldn't do that in my physical office, right? So being clear ahead of time with them, I would say.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things. As Leah mentioned, access right now is very important to consider when we're thinking about our students. They may not be able to Zoom super well. Their Wi-Fi may not be stable. As someone who specifically looks over food and financial insecurity efforts at my campus, many students are still attempting to do the majority of their schoolwork on their phone. And we find it out midway semester when they're not doing well, that is not okay. And, how can we help you? And we're lucky enough that we're able to provide technology, but that's not the case for every school. So one, just, not even having, and remember, students aren't going to tell you, I don't have the things I need. It's very embarrassing for them to say that, especially if you have not built up rapport. So part of this is giving them almost an out of saying, hey, we have various ways of approaching this. If you would like to Zoom, if you would like to call in, if you would like, if we absolutely needed to, as a last resort, we could find a social distancing way to meet with you. I know for us, we actually have a room reserved in case a student had to come in person and couldn't use technology. So we reserved a classroom where we could socially distance from one another. That hasn't been utilized yet, which is good. But there's all the rules that we set up ahead of time and saying, here are guidelines, and letting people know the etiquette around it. But also I think this is the thing that I'm finding the most trend-wise is a lot of it is simple as students, because it's now online and not in person, they're taking screenshots of one another, social media, and simply just emailing me and saying, here's all the things that the student did wrong online. Can you talk to them? And, I don't want them to get kicked out, but they need to be held accountable. And before I do anything before I even launch investigation, the first thing I ask both sides is, have you even had a conversation? Because I think one of the components of this that's really tricky is so many people want to just go into, fix it mode. And my thing is, I understand that Zoom is really easy to forego conversations in person. But my thing is I actually don't want you to tattletale on one another and just send me a screenshot and just be like, fix it. I always say, I want to know if you've had a conversation with this person first. And do you think you can do that? I can certainly hold the student accountable. And while I can't tell you the results of that, you really might want to try to have this conversation. I think we need to encourage the critical thinking in this and have people understand this is what it means to advocate for yourself. And I always say to students, I'd rather you practice advocating for yourself and others here in college than what are you going to do when you go in the real world? You're going to tattletale on your coworkers and show your boss screenshots. That's awkward. Don't do that. So I think, giving them those like living experiences of like, this is not how we do things. And so, and then I've even had to tell students I had students who, really wanted to push a bias incident that was going to be somewhat of a bias incident of a conduct issue. And I was like, let's think about the messages you're sending across in this is that you want to complain, but you're not willing to have the hard conversations. And you think the school should be having these hard conversations on your behalf. I'm like, does that sound right? And they were like, no, we should have these conversations, huh? I was like, yeah, just try them. I'm like, you're going to be future healthcare professionals. The least you can do is try to have these hard conversations and think about what that might look like. So I think that's the way we've been trying to have these conversations is first even have them and then go into, okay, now what is our protocol and policy say on this? And some of this has been creative and trying to make sure what is in our handbook and do we have to kind of explain that further and flesh that out. I think next semester we're going to see that some of our policies need to be further examined and almost articulated as to how do we make this more specific to the time that we have on Zoom, which is tricky.
And to Julia's point too, with the screenshotting, I think your investigatory process changes a little bit when we're doing this online stuff, right? Because as opposed to here's an incident report from some RAs that were doing things, right? Or a student came and they're talking about these experiences. A lot of times when we're doing this online stuff, you're like, yeah, I've got electronic, right? But physical evidence of a conduct violation. And that might be true, right? But you better investigate that because I've had students fake screenshots on things. And that's your job as the investigatory body, right? To be like, are these tweets accurate? Are these Snapchat chat messages accurate and real, which can be hard, right? But basically focusing on like, okay, figuring out, is this evidence real evidence? And then having it just like you normally would in an in-person hearing, right? I've got all of my quote unquote evidence that I want to share with the student in a folder that I can easily share with them up on the screen and be like, yeah, here's the stuff that we're talking about.
Wow, that is really powerful. Thank you both for sharing those stories. Our next question I'll direct to Latoya and then Joshua, but anyone else feel free to piggyback. But how do you respond to your digital communities when they've been harmed by someone's conduct online? How do you work with communications and other offices regarding public messaging?
For us as a small institution, we practice a restorative justice kind of model here. And so we usually want the students who have caused the harm to be held accountable, but we want them to have some self-accountability and acknowledging the impact that they may have directly caused to one particular body or particular population. And we want to give that population the opportunity to express to the alleged perpetrator what that meant and what that felt like. Similar to Julia's point earlier, that, you know, me as a representative of the institution, I don't necessarily get across to students the direct and indirect impact that they've caused, but the students who are subject to it often do. And so in our restorative justice process, that's generally how we handle that. It's a talking circle of sorts, and we have been holding them on Zoom as best we can or in Teams. As far as public relations messaging, a lot of that messaging here comes from our Dean of Students, and it is generally a collaborative email that everyone is kind of chipping into, and our public relations folks sometimes look them over for, you know, those keywords and things that could be potentially triggering or maybe even not necessarily politically correct. But our Dean of Students really bears the brunt of delivering those messages. And we've found that we also get more probably response from our students and whether they liked or didn't like how it was handled when it comes from the Dean of Students versus if it came from like the president's office or the public relations office. And we appreciate that feedback. And so that's why we go that route.
For us here at CCU, this summer, our president put out a call to start a committee that reviews social media conduct related things, not so much like a conduct violation, but more bias or items online that may cause harm in the community. And from that space, it's a team of us, about 10 people, faculty, staff, and students, that meet to kind of discuss what an appropriate response would be. And sometimes that response isn't always public. It's just more so facilitating some of those conversations with the person who reported the incident, as well as those involved. I mean, really coming to kind of incorporating some RJ principles in there, but not like doing the full process, but allowing opportunities to restore harm to happen organically through a conversation. An example I'll share, we had a student that shared a snap, and the caption said, "I see more chink eyes than I did in high school." And so it was reported as it was interpreted as it was being discriminatory against those of Asian descent. But in reality, she was talking about how when you've been high off of smoking marijuana, how your eyes get slanted and low. And that's what she meant. And so we had a conversation around the impact of her words and what that meant to members of her community. Then also incorporated in some of the, had we had to prove the conduct violation that came along with that, had other things been involved. And so that's currently how our process is working. It's fairly new. But I do think that'll be our standard moving forward, as we'll start using it for more social media, online community-based harm that's caused.
I really like Joshua's point about the communicative aspect of it. Sorry, sometimes the English degree gets in my way of trying to make words fancier than they are. You need to communicate with your communities, right? Especially when, like I said before, conduct doesn't happen in a bubble, right? Like you're doing this community work before, and students are not idiots. We know that, right? They are not. And when you are interacting with your online community every day, right? Like let's go real simple and talk, like you have an Instagram account for your office that's interacting with students, programming, all that stuff. And then maybe there's a large scale bias incident on your campus. And suddenly your account's just silent, right? Because you don't want to talk about that case. Students know that. I worked on a bias incident where a student said some pretty nasty racist stuff that we were flooded with reports about it. So we knew, and we did all our processes as according to what we had in our handbook and all that stuff. And the case was resolved in maybe 3 days. This happened on a Saturday, and the student received their hearing and their decision, I think, by Tuesday morning. So conduct folk, we know that's a quick turnaround on a heavy level case. And students were furious with us because they were wondering what was taking so long, because students don't necessarily understand all the background bureaucratic stuff of, yeah, these are your rights and responsibilities, right? Like things take time. But I don't put that misunderstanding on the students' fault, because we didn't say any of that. We did not, we said, we've received your reports, and that was it. And that especially shows when we were talking a whole bunch before that incident happened, right? So I'm a really big proponent of being proactive and transparent in, yeah, I'm not going to talk about the case with our community, right? But hey, we're doing this always, but maybe now's a good time to remind people, here's what the student conduct process is. Like, this is what happens. The student gets something and then they could do this stuff. Because not only is it an opportunity to repair harm, right? It's an opportunity to educate too. And I think when we are doing a lot of student conduct stuff, we are very legally focused because we have to be as a risk management portion of our job. But I think sometimes we focus in too much on, this is only between me, the hearing officer, and the complainant student, when, like all the panelists have said, it's a community harm repairing process, right? And if you're going to leave your community out in the dust about it, a lot of times they're going to feel that way about it.
Well, thank you for sharing those anecdotes. Those are really powerful. As a reminder, if anybody in the audience has any questions, feel free to chat them into the chat box. But moving on to the next pre-submitted audience question. This one's a tricky one. I'll open it up to anybody in the panel who would like to respond. But how do you respond to freedom of speech concerns in digital communities, specifically regarding the 2020 election and its aftermath, but even in regards to other areas of free speech where it might be a gray area, whether you're at a public or a private institution?
That is a tricky question. And we haven't had a lot of that happen here, but we've been having conversations on the what if and when. And I think a lot of it, because it's so, freedom of speech is so vague and like anything can really apply to it, is just really reminding our community of our institutional values and how that's lived out through the student experience, and how they are stewards of their own experience. And so how, if you're saying things through the lens of freedom of speech, still think about the impact that you make on the community and what type of culture you're creating here, and is that what we want to be known for? And so, like, having a lot of those conversations, a lot of that's come out through our student government, through our programming board, various leadership groups we have on campus are all emphasizing the importance of being social justice minded and equitable and inclusive in all what we and all of what we do. I really applaud our students. I don't know them very well because I'm new here, but I do applaud them in their efforts. As things have happened online, they've been quick to respond and combat a lot of what's been happening online through DMs and conversations and through calling each other out, but in a way to, like, let's have a conversation about why this is wrong and why this was impactful. So that's the lens that we've taken here. I'm sure next week may bring us a new set of challenges, but we'll see.
I think there's a couple of things with freedom of speech that we need to consider. A couple of things. One is, I think when we're talking about freedom of speech, remember our roles. So I always say that I'm a dean of students, I'm a dean for all students, which is really tricky to say that because quite frankly, I'm at a school that is actually largely conservative. And so I think one of the things that I need to acknowledge is that I have many students who have never met a queer, Latinx, non-binary person. That to them is like a unicorn because I am a unicorn, okay? But I think the thing is, I have to acknowledge that I'm not an activist in this lens. I'm an activist outside of higher education. You'll see me at all the marches. You'll see me talking about my own personal freedoms of speeches. But I think what's important is in my role as a dean, I'm a dean for all of my students. And so I have to acknowledge that there might be students that have their personal values. And I'm here to talk to them again, I think very much as Joshua mentioned, you know, what is intent versus impact? I think that the other part is understanding my unconscious biases. So if I'm someone who is in charge of a hearing of some sort, one, I need to acknowledge my own growth and where am I making assumptions in language, but also how am I conducting a hearing? Because if I don't understand my unconscious biases, then how am I going to be a role model for my students, staff, and faculty to address theirs in these hearings as well? Another thing is, and I'll give you a link that this is one on unconscious biases, but also this one I think is actually the one that talks about Zoom and freedom of speech. And it gives you some good language about how you could potentially look at this information. Because I think what's important to understand is people are able to, actually that's one for unconscious biases. I'll send you another one. It's from, I think, Boise in Idaho, that talks a lot about Zoom. You can have freedom of speech, but at some point, if it interrupts what a community is trying to do in gathering, that is something that is seen as disruptive, and therefore you could be held accountable for more that you are disrupting a community event, rather base it on what someone is saying. And in addition, depending on what they're saying, could then be seen as, you know, bias motivated. So I think it's letting students understand, and this is something I was very particular with a student yesterday. Actually, I said, I understand what you're saying, but remember, I was like, there's something about the opinion versus your opinion is now harming someone, and let's break that down. So I can definitely go ahead and I'll share that second link with you all.
I think too, and again, I will always, I think, sound like a broken record talking about student conduct is not an island, but especially when we're talking about freedom of speech and the upcoming presidential election, you need institutional support, right, as a conduct professional. And when I say institutional support, I mean upper level institutional support that's very clear on, like, this is what we deem as acceptable and not acceptable before you're hitting these issues. Your deans, your vice presidents, your senior advisory board of the college needs to be talking about, here's what the college's kind of approach is to responding to like freedom of expression concerns, and what sort of conduct falls underneath that. Because frankly, does this report fall under freedom of speech? As a hearing officer, I don't think you are really ever making that call. I don't. You don't get paid enough. I don't get paid enough. That's what your school leadership really needs to be doing, because you can have the hearing. There's no doubt in that you can handle a hearing on that. But if you're not clear on, like, yeah, I have had these conversations with my leadership and I know what I'm going into with this, it's going to be really difficult, because that sort of stuff, when it's really stuff that is so detrimental and damaging and harmful that it surpasses, like Joshua said, the very high freedom of speech and expression mandate we have in this country, then you're going to need your school behind you on that one.
Yeah, I might just add that in general, when we're talking about freedom of speech, we kind of move out of the realm of logical things. Usually when someone is saying something and they're falling back on freedom of speech, it's because they've made a statement that is emotion-filled and passion-filled. And so trying to have a logical conversation is probably not the route. And so to Liam's point, having a clear understanding of your institution's culture and the precedent that has been set for situations like this is really necessary. I might also encourage that, as Julia said, you got to know yourself in these situations, and it's okay to say no, right? It's okay to say, I am not the person to handle this situation because it has triggered me in the following ways. And that's 100% okay.
And something quickly just to put in there is, as someone who runs bias reporting systems, but also studies them, one of the things that ends up happening a lot is that we find that institutions will often tokenize people of color to join bias response teams. And in doing so, those individuals are usually the people doing the diversity work at a college campus. One, we need to stop using their emotional labor. Two, if you're going to use their emotional labor, have a system where people can rotate in and out. For instance, if something is specifically homophobic or something of that sort, or that it attacks my personal identities, I may not be someone who can be unbiased in that situation. And then I got to say, you know what? And I actually have a couple of colleagues the other day. I was like, I think you're actually a better teacher in this moment. You share some similar identities with a student. I think they might better learn from you. And we tag team on with each other all the time on different types of scenarios, because we recognize that representation matters, and that we might be able to work with students in different various ways. Him as a white male is very different than me as a Latinx non-binary person. So we are able to see each other's strengths, but also it gives me a chance to say, you know what, not today. I can still do my job, but maybe this incident is too hitting home. And what I don't want to do is burn out on the job and have compassion fatigue. And if you have any questions, there's actually a great dissertation that came out by Jill Bassett from NASPA Region 1, who studies vicarious trauma in Title IX. But I think a lot of that work can be very similar in that we're talking about secondary or vicarious trauma when you are of these identities of people you're trying to uphold in systems. And that can be very damaging because you're holding a lot of emotions. So that's why I really say, check in with yourself with your own biases.
Thank you. Actually, going back to Julia, we have a question from the audience in regards to freedom of speech. And could you go a little more in depth on sanctions? Besides like the trainings, this person asked about community service or papers or video reviews. So how do you really handle like these sanctions, especially for these tricky freedom of speech questions?
Yeah, I mean, I actually try really hard to use education as a non-sanction effort. I've done anything from, why don't you write me a paper on this? Or let's talk about, can we write a paper where it's talking about both perspectives? And I'm not saying that you have to choose one. And I always say to students, recognize I cannot change your perspective. Only you have the power to change your perspective on these things. What I can offer you though is to think about what this can look like from both ways, just so you get a better sense of when you're saying things, again, how does that impact others? I might even have them write about, what is, understanding what is a bias incident report and understanding some of that information. Sometimes I've done, meetings with, it depends on the kind of case, but one meeting is sometimes also a check-in. We're doing a bit of a, okay, this was problematic, but it also sounds like other things are going on. So sometimes me and another department have come together and had a team meeting where we're more just saying, we recognize that this came off as you having an opinion, but it sounds like something is really actually going on. And let's make sure that we can both kind of work with you to figure out what's really happening, what are some resources we can offer you, and how are you doing? So I think those are kind of two non-disciplinary ways that I've really, tried to work with students. I mean, the other ways is sometimes I have conversations where I have another person I'm talking with, and if they've had also multiple issues, we kind of just say, let's go through this and let's talk about why this keeps reoccurring. I do that sometimes, especially because for some students, to have two different types of perspectives is very important, where they realize, okay, it's not just Dean Golden is offended by this, it's, oh, I have two different people who are saying that this might be problematic. And then we both have a different way we kind of say, let's consider this. And so I think those are the ways I try to really uphold students. we also have different software where students can go through definitions, terminology, and understand information on bias trainings and such. So I think that that's another is through colleague, and I think that that's been something that's been helpful.
I think to Julia's point too, like students are human beings, right? They can contain multiplicities at the same time, where you could have done something very harmful and you could also be going through something that's very harmful in your life that I could be helping you with, and those can exist at the same time, right? It doesn't excuse behavior, but it informs that behavior. And we've talked a lot about, grazingly, about restorative justice today, which I think is really awesome stuff. But the core tenet of it, right, is accepting responsibility for the harm that you create. And as Julie was talking about, those conversations where you can have with a student work if the student accepts that they cause some harm, right? If a student is not hearing or getting why what they've done is even really an issue, right? Especially when it comes to sort of bias-related speech, it can be very hard to try and go about that the same way. Where in 1 month, it was a very long month, I had two separate but like similar anti-LGBTQ bias-related incidents regarding language. It was very odd to have them both at the same time in the same week. It was a long week. But it was very like two paths in a wood diverge, because we had one student who didn't get why what they said was harmful, but understood that harm occurred. And so that was like that foot in, right, where I had conversations with them that ended up being really productive, and we got into a whole bunch of other stuff going on in their life, and it actually was like, oh, cool, a high impact moment that we repaired some harm in the community, and we also got you to be a better student. Awesome. The other one, not understanding nor accepting the harm that they caused, still I tried to go about it the same way through these weekly conversations with this student. And like Julie was talking about, it was the most draining experience of my life as a gay man, trying to get you to understand from the institution's perspective, right, how dehumanizing your words were. So it's that core kind of part of restorative justice, right, where do you accept the harm that you caused and recognize it? Because if not, if we're not going anywhere and you clearly aren't recognizing the impact of your behavior, I think that's where you then move into more sanctioning, which is never as fun.
Thank you. A great question. I'm loving the resources happening in the chat. Another audience question. Do any of the panelists have insights on how to properly set up a bias response team in a way that doesn't infringe on free speech, how to avoid what happened at the University of Michigan bias response team, but can help students navigate the tough conversations or issues that aren't necessarily a conduct issue?
I guess I'll say a few things. I think that what ended up happening with University of Michigan, if I'm not wrong, is now they're trying to say that let's focus on the campus climate of our institution. And I think one of the things I'll just say is that when you are even creating bias teams, bias response teams, I think what really needs to happen first and foremost is make sure that you are already having surveys and campus climate reviews that show the need for it. Because here's the thing is, a lot of times what happens is institutions try to set up something and they don't have anything to prove or show that this process is needed. So I think it's one thing if you were able to say, well, you know what, we surveyed all our campuses and students wanted this, and even having students, and I've been at campuses where students are actually a part of bias response teams. And so I think it's about taking on the responsibility of showing that this is a community effort. I think, you know, one of my biggest concerns about conduct bias Title IX is that a lot of schools don't take it on as a community effort. It ends up falling to only the people with those jobs. And I think that the successful institutions are ones that have campaigns and show that it's okay to report these things, that a lot of reasons students don't come forward is around the stigma of even reporting. One thing that we see right now, at least in the city of Boston, and unfortunately, this is so unfortunate, hospitals have reported back to the institutions that something as simple as, not something as simple, I should say, but students are going to the hospitals and asking to see sane nurses in sexual assault because they don't want to report back to their schools that they went to a party where they could have potentially caught COVID and were then sexually assaulted. And so they don't want to get reported back to the school that they went to a party and get kicked out because of COVID. So now they're just not responding at all to, they don't want to tell the school that they got sexually assaulted. They don't want to have anything to do with the school. So to me, that would say is, I think now more than ever as institutions, how do we work with students to also start these campaigns and allow them to know that if these are things that they want, like how can we support them truly? Because I think, to me, it's, if you had already had the campus climate showing this was needed, maybe the courts would have seen it differently rather than we did this and then we were questioned on it. And that's just my 2 cents. I'm not a legal expert on this necessarily, but I do think that when you typically get to show that a campus, overall, the people of a campus want something, you're better able to implement it. And truly, it's not just about a process, it's the education around the process. So are you having students understand, I'm not here to question your opinions. I'm here to make sure that you're not causing further harm on that. There's a difference in that language. And I think that that's part of the education when you're creating a bias response team. But there's a lot of different journal articles. I'll see if I can find a couple to share with folks about bias response teams, that those are different ways to set them up. I think it's important to remember too, bias response teams were really only created around the year of 2000. The bias response teams are only about 20 years old on college campuses. A lot of us probably feel like they must have been around forever because I know personally me, I only graduated college in 2006, but they're pretty brand new. And so I think we're still finding the best ways to implement them.
Thank you, Julia. At this point, I am going to turn it over to Liam.
Thank you, Corinna. Just we're cognizant to make sure that I'm sure plenty of you have something going on at 1, or you may not, but we want to get you out of here a little bit before. So I know we didn't get to all of the questions that were asked, or you may have your own that you didn't want to submit yourself necessarily. So by all means, you can email that to any of the panelists if you want. You can send it to me. Does not matter. I'm trying to get this next slide to go, but now I can't figure out how I did that. Oh, which is too bad. Well, that's okay. So I will send y'all an email with all of our panelists' contact info, which is a little weird to say as a panelist. But if we could just give a quick Zoom cheer, round of applause in your home, whatever, to everybody that came out to help today, that would be awesome. And to all of y'all too. I know this is a tough topic sometimes, but also one that I'm happy that people are here chatting about. I am sending a quick little assessment form in the chat if you want to just take that right after. It is not an assessment for assessment's sake. The technology KC does use it to improve our programs for the future. But other than that, thank you so much for being here with us today, and good luck heading into the election day season and after, and stay safe.